March 28, 1942, mid-morning. The port of St Nazaire on the Atlantic coast of occupied France. A German naval officer stands on the quayside of the largest dry dock in the world, staring at something that does not make sense. Wedged into the southern caisson of the former Écluse Louis Joubert, the dock the French built for the great liner Normandie, is the crumpled bow of a British destroyer. She is listing. Her superstructure is riddled with holes. Her decks are slicked with blood. 2 of her 4 funnels have been removed, and the remaining 2 have been cut at a strange diagonal angle to make her look, from a distance, like a German torpedo boat. She rammed the dock gate 6 hours ago, at 1:34 in the morning, at nearly 20 knots. British commandos poured off her decks and fought through the dock area for 2 hours, before being killed or captured. And now she sits there, inert, embedded in the steel of the caisson, like a spent bullet in a wall. German engineers have already been aboard. They have walked her decks. They have inspected her hull. They have concluded that she is an obsolete American-built destroyer, a leftover from the last war, too light and too old to have done any real damage to the gate. A senior German officer has told the captured British captain, a man named Stephen Beatty, that the dock will be repaired in short order. Beatty has said nothing. He has not argued. He has not protested. He has simply looked at the German and waited. By 10 o'clock that morning, word has spread through the garrison that there are supplies aboard the wreck. Chocolate, cigarettes, tinned provisions. Curiosity has done the rest. German soldiers have been climbing aboard all morning, poking through the compartments, taking souvenirs. A formal inspection party of roughly 40 senior officers and civilian administrators has assembled on and around the ship for an official tour. The atmosphere, by every account that survives, is not one of alarm. It is one of mild amusement. The British have sailed an obsolete destroyer up the Loire, lost half their men, and accomplished nothing that the Germans can see. The German officer on the quayside is watching this with the professional calm of a man who has been at war for 3 years and has learned to distinguish a real threat from a spent one. He has classified the destroyer as spent. Hundreds of other Germans on and around the dock have reached the same conclusion. Nobody has found anything unusual in the bow. Nobody has noticed the steel tanks behind the forward gun support, sealed-in concrete containing 4.5 tons of high explosive, armed with delayed action fuses that were supposed to have detonated 6 hours ago. At 10:35, the bow of the destroyer disappears. The explosion kills more than 350 Germans instantly. Officers, soldiers, engineers, sightseers, souvenir hunters. The 1,500-ton steel caisson is torn apart. The Atlantic rushes in. The wreck of the destroyer is swept into the dry dock on the flood. The largest dry dock on the Atlantic coast of Europe, the only dock between Norway and the Mediterranean that can hold the most dangerous warship in the German fleet, ceases to exist. The German officer on the quayside, if he survived, and the records do not tell us whether he did, would have had one question. It is the question the entire German garrison at St Nazaire would ask in the hours and days that followed, a question that would reach Hitler's headquarters and change the way Germany defended every port on the Atlantic coast from that morning forward. The question was not how the British had done it. The mechanics of the ramming were obvious enough. The question was why. Why had the British sent 600 men on a mission that everyone in the planning chain, from the Commandos themselves to the admirals who approved the operation, knew in advance would probably kill most of them? Why had they packed a destroyer with enough explosive to destroy a dock that, by any rational military calculation, was not worth the lives it would cost? And why, when the shooting started and the plan began to fall apart, had the men aboard those little wooden boats kept coming? To understand the answer, we need to go back not to the planning rooms of combined operations in London, not even to the day the order was signed. We need to go back to a fjord in northern Norway, to the shadow of a mountain, and to a single German warship anchored in the cold water beneath it, because it was the existence of that ship, and the fear of what it might do if it ever reached the open Atlantic. That put 600 British volunteers on a course for a French port most of them had never heard of. This is the story of how a group of men who knew they were sailing into a trap sailed into it anyway, and of what the Germans found when they boarded the ship those men left behind. The warship in the Norwegian fjord was the Tirpitz. She was the sister ship of the Bismarck, the battleship that had terrorized the Royal Navy in May of 1941 by sinking the battlecruiser Hood with a single salvo and then leading half the British fleet on a chase across the North Atlantic before being cornered and destroyed. The Bismarck was dead, but the Tirpitz was alive, and in early 1942 she was the most dangerous surface warship on Earth. She displaced more than 52,000 tons fully loaded. She carried 8 15-inch guns, arranged in 4 twin turrets. Her secondary armament included 12 5.9-inch guns and 16 4.1-inch anti-aircraft guns. Her belt armour was 12.5 inches thick. She could make 30 knots. She was faster than any British battleship afloat, and more heavily armoured than most of them. And she was sitting in a Norwegian fjord doing absolutely nothing, which was, from the British point of view, almost worse than if she had been at sea. The mere rumour of a Tirpitz sortie was enough to disrupt the entire Allied war effort. In March of 1942, the same month the St Nazaire raid was approved, Tirpitz sailed briefly from her anchorage in Trondheim Fjord to intercept convoy PQ-12 bound for Russia. She did not find the convoy. She returned to port, but the attempt forced the Admiralty to divert the battleships King George V, Duke of York, and Renown, the aircraft carrier Victorious, a heavy cruiser, and 12 destroyers, simply to cover the possibility that she might appear. That was the power of a fleet in being. One ship sitting at anchor, consuming the resources of an entire navy just by existing. Because as long as Tirpitz existed, the Royal Navy had to assume she might break out into the Atlantic at any moment, the way Bismarck had. And as long as that assumption held, the Admiralty had to keep a disproportionate force of capital ships in home waters, ships that were desperately needed in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, just to guard against the possibility that Tirpitz might move. Churchill understood this perfectly. He wrote in a directive in January of 1942 that the destruction or even the crippling of this ship was the greatest event at sea at the present time, and that no other target was comparable to it. The ship did not have to fire a single shell to be effective. Her mere existence tied down an entire fleet. But Tirpitz had a problem that the British planners had identified very early on. If she broke out into the Atlantic and sustained damage, she would need a dock large enough to repair her. There were docks in Germany, but getting a crippled battleship back through the North Sea and the English Channel, past the RAF and the Royal Navy, would be a suicidal journey. The only alternative was a dock on the Atlantic coast itself. And on the entire Atlantic coast of occupied Europe, from the northern tip of Norway to the Spanish border, there was exactly one dry dock, large enough to hold a ship of Tirpitz size. It was the former Écluse Louis Joubert at St Nazaire. The dock had been built between 1929 and 1934. It was designed by the engineer Albert Cackert, the same man who designed the internal framework of the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro. It measured 350 metres long and 50 metres wide. Its caisson gates weighed 1,500 tons apiece. It had been built to service the SS Normandie, which at the time of its construction was the largest ocean liner in the world. It could accommodate vessels of up to 85,000 tons. It was a masterpiece of engineering, and it was the key to the entire strategic problem. If the dock at St Nazaire were destroyed, Tirpitz could not be repaired on the Atlantic coast. If Tirpitz could not be repaired on the Atlantic coast, the risk of sending her into the open ocean became unacceptable even by German standards. If the risk became unacceptable, Tirpitz would stay in Norway. And if Tirpitz stayed in Norway, The Royal Navy could release the capital ships guarding against her breakout and send them where they were actually needed. The logic was clean. The problem was execution. St Nazaire was 6 miles up the Loire estuary, behind minefields, shore batteries, submarine pens, and a garrison of roughly 5,000 troops. The port was home to 2 U-boat flotillas, the 6th under Kapitän-Leutnant Georg Wilhelm Schultz, and the 7th under Korvettenkapitän Herbert Solar. The harbour defences were formidable. The 280th Naval Artillery Battalion, under Kapitän Zohr C. Edo Dickmann, controlled 28 guns ranging from 75mm field pieces to 280mm railway guns that could reach far out into the estuary. The 22nd Naval Flak Brigade under Kapitän C. Karl Konrad Mecker added another 43 anti-aircraft guns, 20 to 40mm, most of them dual-purpose, capable of being depressed to fire at surface targets on the water. The day before the raid on March 27th, Vice Admiral Karl Donitz himself, commander of the entire German U-boat fleet, inspected the base at St Nazaire. During the visit, someone raised the question of what would happen in the event of a British commando attack on the port. Solar, the commander of the 7th U-boat flotilla, replied that such an attack would be hazardous and highly improbable. Donitz paused and said something that history has preserved precisely because of what happened the following night. He said, "Well, I would not be so sure about that. The RAF could not bomb the dock without obliterating the town and killing thousands of French civilians. The Special Operations Executive could not sabotage a target of that size with clandestine agents. A conventional naval bombardment would be detected long before it reached the estuary. By every standard military assessment, an attack on the Normandie Dock at St Nazaire was, in the words that Lord Mountbatten would later use, something that could be attempted only because it seemed in the eyes of the enemy to be absolutely impossible." The plan that emerged from combined operations in early 1942 was not so much a plan as a calculated act of controlled insanity. Take an obsolete destroyer, strip her down, pack her bow with 4.5 tons of high explosive on delayed action fuses, disguise her to look like a German torpedo boat, sail her up the Loire estuary at night under the German guns, ram her into the dock gate at full speed, send commandos ashore to destroy the dock's pumping and winding machinery, withdraw the surviving men by motor launch, and then, hours later, after the Germans have boarded the destroyer, after they have inspected her and dismissed her, after they have concluded that the raid was a brave but ultimately futile gesture, let the delayed action fuses do their work. The deception was the hinge. The entire plan depended on the Germans not understanding what the destroyer was until it was too late. Not before the ramming, when the ship had to be mistaken for a German vessel, sewed, and not after the ramming, when the ship had to be mistaken for an ordinary wreck. The British were building a weapon that would destroy its target by being underestimated twice. The destroyer they chose was HMS Campbeltown. She had been built as the USS Buchanan, a Wicks-class destroyer laid down in 1918 and commissioned in 1919 for the United States Navy. She was one of the 50 old American destroyers transferred to Britain in the Destroyers 4 Bases deal of 1940. She was slow, outdated, and expendable, which made her perfect. The conversion took about 10 days at Devonport. Her 3 4-inch guns were removed, her torpedoes and depth charges were stripped, 2 of her 4 funnels were cut away, and the 2 that remained were sliced at an angle to mimic the profile of a German Mo-class torpedo boat. Extra armour plate was bolted along her sides and around her bridge to protect the commandos who would ride on her open decks. A 12-pounder gun was fitted forward, and 8 20mm Oerlikon cannons were added for close-range defence. The explosives were the work of Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz, a 28-year-old ordnance specialist from HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's torpedo and mining school at Portsmouth. He designed a charge consisting of 24 Mark 7 depth charges containing approximately 4.5 tons of amatol. The charges were placed in steel tanks behind the forward gun support and sealed in concrete, so that even a close inspection would not reveal them. They were armed with delayed action pencil fuses, chemical timers that used acid to eat through a wire, releasing a spring-loaded striker. The timing was imprecise by nature. The fuses were set to give the crew time to disembark, and the Commandos time to complete their demolitions, with detonation expected sometime before 9 in the morning. Tirpitz understood that he was building a weapon he would have to ride into the target. He did not survive the night. During the chaotic withdrawal, he was aboard Motor Launch 177, which was hit and sunk in the estuary. His body was never recovered. The weapon he had designed and placed with his own hands would detonate the following morning without him, and it would accomplish exactly what he had intended. He was 28 years old. The Naval Force commander was Commander Robert Ryder, known to his friends as Red. He was 34 years old, born in India on February 16, 1908, the son of Colonel Charles Henry Dudley Ryder, who had been the Surveyor General of India. He was educated at Cheltenham College and entered the Royal Navy in 1926 at the age of 17. He was a polar explorer. He had commanded the expedition ship Penola on the British Graham Land expedition to Antarctica between 1934 and 1937, navigating some of the most dangerous waters on Earth for 3 years and charting coastline that no ship had ever approached. For this he was awarded the Polar Medal. He was the only man in history who would hold both the Polar Medal and the Victoria Cross. His war before St Nazaire had already been marked by the kind of quiet, persistent courage that does not make headlines. He had commanded the Q-ship HMS Edgehill, which was torpedoed in 1940, leaving Ryder and his crew adrift in the Atlantic for 4 days before rescue. Both his brothers would die in the war. One was killed in the Le Paradis massacre of 1940, when soldiers of the SS Totenkopf Division machine-gunned nearly 100 British prisoners of the Royal Norfolk Regiment in a farmyard. The other died in captivity after the fall of Singapore. Ryder carried this with him. He did not talk about it. After the war, he became a Conservative Member of Parliament. He died in 1986. The military commander of the Commando Force was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, known to everyone as Colonel Charles. He was 37 years old, from Buckhurst Hill in Essex. Before the war, he had been a civil engineer with the firm W&C French. He had joined the Territorial Army in 1925 at the age of 21 and had risen to the rank of major by 1939. He was older than almost every man under his command, and he was respected in the way that older, steady, unshowy men are respected by younger men about to do something dangerous. He had raised and trained No. 2 Commando from scratch in 1941. Most of the men who would follow him into St Nazaire had volunteered because he had asked them to. None of them knew where they were going until the briefing at Falmouth. The Commando force numbered approximately 265 men drawn from No. 2 Commando and from numbers 1, 3, 4, 5, 9, and 12 Commandos. They were divided into assault, demolition, and protection teams, each with a precise objective inside the dock complex. The demolition teams are trained at the King George V dock in Southampton and at Cardiff and Burntisland, practicing on dock machinery similar to what they would find at St Nazaire. They learned to set their charges within 10 minutes. They practiced blindfolded. Bray? Oh. Captain Bill Pritchard of the Royal Engineers, whose father was dockmaster at Cardiff Docks and who had pre-war experience in the Great Western Railway dockyards, was the chief demolition advisor. He knew the machinery better than any man in the force. He would be killed during the raid. The little ships that would carry the Commandos and cover the withdrawal were 16 Fairmile B motor launches. They were wooden-hulled. They were powered by petrol engines. Each one carried a 500-gallon auxiliary fuel tank on its open deck. In practical terms, this meant that if a single tracer round hit the deck, the launch would become a floating bonfire within seconds. The men who sailed them knew this. The men who planned the operation knew this. The launches went anyway. There was one other vessel in the flotilla that carried a specific and peculiar assignment. Motor Torpedo Boat 74, commanded by Sub-Lieutenant Mick Wynne, was fitted with 2 delayed-action torpedoes. Wynne's orders were to fire them into the lock gates of the old entrance, the secondary lock that connected the inner basin to the river. The torpedoes were equipped with long-delay fuses designed to detonate days after impact. The idea was that even if the Normandie Dock caisson was somehow repaired, the destruction of the old entrance would make the entire dock system unusable. MTB-74 had a mechanical eccentricity that became part of the folklore of the raid. Her engines operated only 2 speeds, a slow 6 knots or a flat-out 33 knots, with nothing usable in between. She crossed the Bay of Biscay by leapfrogging ahead of the convoy at high speed, then cutting her engines and waiting for the slower vessels to catch up. It was not elegant, it worked. The flotilla left Falmouth at 2 in the afternoon on March 26, 1942. They sailed a deceptive course designed to suggest an anti-submarine sweep, heading toward the Bay of Biscay or Gibraltar. On the morning of March 27th, the German submarine U-593 sighted the force about 130 miles west of St Nazaire. HMS Tyndale, one of the 2 escorting Hunt-class destroyers, attacked the U-boat, and its captain reported the British force as heading away from the coast. It was a fortunate error. The British ruse held. That evening, the force located the navigation light of HMS Sturgeon, a submarine positioned as a beacon, to confirm their approach course. The destroyers Atherstone and Tyndale peeled off to wait at the rendezvous point. The little ships went on alone. Just before midnight, the RAF began its diversionary bombing of St Nazaire. The plan called for the bombers to distract the German anti-aircraft batteries while the flotilla entered the estuary. But low cloud made precision bombing impossible, and to avoid killing French civilians, the pilots circled and dropped their bombs one at a time instead of in concentrated sticks. The irregular pattern caught the attention of Captain Sir C. Carl Conrad Mecke, the commander of the harbour's flak defences. Mecke had 43 anti-aircraft guns under his command. He was a careful man. The strange behaviour of the bombers alarmed him. He sent a signal that would make the night measurably harder for every British sailor and commando on the water. The signal read, "I do not understand the behaviour of the enemy. I suspect parachutists." He ordered all units to full alert. Shortly after midnight, the convoy crossed the shallow shoals of the Loire estuary. Campbeltown scraped bottom twice, but pulled free. At 1:22 in the morning, the flotilla was caught by German searchlights. A signal lamp on shore began demanding identification. This was the moment the deception had been built for. A British signalman, dressed in a German naval uniform, began replying in German using a call sign extracted from a captured German signal book, reportedly taken during a previous commando raid on the Norwegian coast. He identified the force as a German vessel that had sustained damage and was requesting permission to enter the harbour. The exchange went back and forth. The shore batteries hesitated. Every second of hesitation was distance closed. Every 100 yards of distance closed was another 100 yards that the German gunners would not have to correct for. When the shore batteries finally opened fire, the British made the international signal for a vessel being fired upon by friendly forces. It was an audacious lie. It bought them several more minutes. At those speeds, several minutes was the difference between reaching the dock and being sunk in the estuary. In total, the deception bought the flotilla approximately 6 to 8 minutes of uncontested passage, minutes in which the distance between the convoy and the dock shrank from something survivable to something the Germans could no longer prevent. At approximately 1:28, the deception failed completely. The German guns found their range. Every searchlight on the harbour swung onto the flotilla. The river was suddenly as bright as a stage. Campbeltown's captain, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, ordered the German colours struck and the white ensign raised. Every gun on every British vessel opened fire. The motor launches, lit up on a flat river against a darkened shore, began taking hits almost immediately. The 500-gallon fuel tanks did exactly what everyone had known they would do. Boats began to burn. Some were hit so quickly that their crews had no time to disembark the commandos they were carrying. Men died on the river without ever reaching the dock. On Campbeltown's bridge, the helmsman was killed. His replacement was wounded within seconds. Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz, the explosives officer, the man who had built the bomb in the bow, took the wheel himself and held course. Beatty stood beside him, giving corrections, watching the dock gate grow larger in the searchlights as the ship accelerated toward the caisson under point-blank fire from both banks of the estuary. Shells were striking the ship fore and aft. Commandos on the open deck were being hit. The noise, by every survivor's account, was beyond anything they had experienced. A solid wall of sound that made speech impossible and communication a matter of gesture and instinct. The run from the moment the white ensign was raised to the moment of impact lasted approximately 6 minutes. Every second of those 6 minutes is described in the survivor accounts as the longest of their lives. At 1:34 in the morning on March 28, 1942, HMS Campbeltown struck the southern caisson of the Normandie Dock at approximately 19 knots. Her bow crumpled inward for about 33 feet, driving the hidden explosive charge directly against the steel of the gate. She was 4 minutes behind schedule. Beatty, standing on the ruined bridge, looked at the wreckage around him and allowed himself a brief smile. Then he said to the officers beside him, "Well, there we are, 4 minutes late. 4 minutes late." He had just rammed an explosive-laden destroyer into a German-held dock at full speed under searchlights and artillery fire. And he was apologizing for his timekeeping. The commandos went over the side the moment the ship stopped moving. They had been crouching on the open decks for 6 minutes under fire that had killed and wounded men all around them. Several were already dead on the deck before the ship hit. Others were wounded and could not climb down. Those who could move poured down scaling ladders and rope nets onto the dock and into the fight. Each team had a memorized objective. Each man had practiced his specific task so many times that muscle memory could take over when thought became impossible. Each team knew that if it failed, the dock might be repaired even after Campbeltown's charges blew. The pumping station, the winding houses, the caisson operating machinery, all of it had to be destroyed by hand, with charges placed precisely on the critical components, in the dark, under fire, within minutes. Lieutenant Stuart Chant of No. 5 Commando led the demolition team assigned to the main pumping station, the single most important target in the entire dock complex. Without the pumps, the dock could not be drained or filled. Without the dock's operating capability, even a repaired caisson would be useless. Chant was wounded before he left the ship. He was hit in the arm and the leg while climbing down the ladder. He kept moving. His team fought their way into the pump house, descended roughly 40 feet into the pumping chamber beneath the dock, placed explosive charges on each of the massive electric pumps, set 90-second fuses, and ran. They made it out. The pump house erupted behind them. The machinery that had taken years to build was rubble in seconds. Chant would receive the military cross for those minutes. Nearby, Lieutenant Corin Purden's team destroyed the northern winding house. Lieutenant Christopher Smalley's team wrecked another winding house. The demolitions were systematic, precise, and executed under fire by men who had rehearsed this so many times that their hands moved from memory even when their minds were occupied with staying alive. While the demolition teams worked, the motor launches were dying on the river. The plan had called for some of the launches to land commando teams at the Old Mole, a stone jetty on the southern side of the harbour, and for the remaining launches to evacuate the commandos after the demolitions were complete. The Old Mole was never secured. The German fire was too heavy. Motor Launch 192 was hit and caught fire as it came alongside the Old Mole. Though Captain Mickey Byrne and some of his commandos managed to scramble ashore before the boat was engulfed. Motor Launch 262 was sunk. Motor Launch 267 caught fire and drifted burning down the river. The petrol tanks turned the river into a corridor of burning fuel. Men were swimming through fire. Motor launch crews who survived the destruction of their boats hauled wounded men out of the water in the dark, while machine gun tracers skipped off the surface around them. Of the 16 motor launchers that had entered the estuary, only a handful would make it back to the open sea to rendezvous with the waiting destroyers. The rest were sunk, captured, or burned to the waterline. The human cost was concentrated in the Royal Navy. Of the 169 men killed in Operation Chariot, 105 were sailors. In the middle of this, aboard Motor Launch 306, which had failed to land its commandos, was now trying to withdraw down the river. A sergeant from the Royal Engineers was doing something that the German officer who witnessed it would remember for the rest of his life. Sergeant Thomas Durant was 23 years old. He had been born in Green Street Green, Farnborough, in Kent. Before the war, he had worked as a butcher's boy and then as a builder's labourer. He had enlisted in the Royal Engineers in 1937 at the age of 18. He was not a commando by training. He had been attached to No. 1 Commando for the raid. His job aboard ML306 was to man the twin Lewis gun mounted on the aft deck. As the launch tried to escape down the Loire in the darkness, it was intercepted by the German torpedo boat Jaguar, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Karl Pohl. The Jaguar was a warship of over 900 tons. She carried 3 4.1-inch guns. She closed to point-blank range and opened fire. ML306 was a wooden boat with no armour. There was no contest. Durant kept firing. He was hit and kept firing. He was hit again and kept firing. The German commander called on the launch to surrender. Durant answered with a burst of Lewis gunfire, aimed at the Jaguar's bridge. He was hit a third time and kept firing. He was called upon to surrender a second time, and again answered with his gun. By the time the launch was finally disabled and its surviving crew taken prisoner, Durant had been wounded at least 16 times. He died the following day. A week later, Kapitänleutnant Pohl met Colonel Newman at the prisoner of war camp at Rennes. Pohl sought Newman out specifically. He told Newman what he had seen. He said that the sergeant on the Lewis gun had fought with a courage he had never witnessed in any man, in any navy, in any war. And then Friedrich Karl Pohl, a German naval officer, formally recommended that Sergeant Thomas Durant of the Royal Engineers be awarded the highest British decoration for valour. It is one of only 3 Victoria Crosses of the Second World War to be recommended by an enemy officer, alongside those of Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roop of HMS Glowworm and Flying Officer Lloyd Trigg of the Royal New Zealand Air Force. It remains the only Victoria Cross ever awarded to a soldier for a naval action. Thomas Durant, a butcher's boy from Kent who had joined the Royal Engineers at 18, received it posthumously. There was another man on the water that night whose name belongs in this story. Able seaman William Alfred Savage was the gun layer on the forward pom-pom of motor gunboat 314, the headquarters vessel carrying Commander Ryder and Colonel Newman. Savage was 29 years old, from Smethwick in Staffordshire. He had joined the Royal Navy before the war. He was not an officer, he was not a commando, he was a sailor doing his job. His job was to stand in the open, at a gun mount on the forward deck of a small boat, sailing up an estuary under concentrated fire, and to keep shooting. He manned his gun from the moment the flotilla was illuminated by searchlights to the moment the boat withdrew down the river. He was under continuous fire for over an hour. The pom-pom was the most exposed position on the most exposed vessel in the flotilla. He never left his position, he never stopped firing. He was killed at his gun during the withdrawal, hit by German fire, while covering the retreat of the motor launchers behind him. He received the Victoria Cross posthumously. His citation says only that he showed the highest devotion to duty. The words do not capture what it means to stand at a gun for an hour while the world around you is burning, and to keep pulling the trigger till you cannot. On the dockside, with the river ablaze and the motor launches destroyed or driven off, Colonel Newman made the assessment that defined the rest of the night. There would be no evacuation by sea. The boats were gone. The men still alive on the dock had two choices: surrender or fight through the town and try to escape overland. Newman chose to fight. His second in command, Major William Copland, was standing beside him. Newman said, "Well, chaps, we have missed the boat. We will just have to walk home." Copland's reply was immediate. "Certainly not, Colonel. We will fight our way out." Newman looked at the bridge that connected the dock area to the old town of St Nazaire. German fire was coming from the far side. He turned to the men behind him, roughly 100 commandos, many of them wounded, all of them out of ammunition or close to it, and said 3 words: "Away you go, lads." They charged the bridge. What followed became known in Commando lore as the St Nazaire steeplechase. Groups of commandos fought through the streets of the old town in the darkness, heading south toward the open country, hoping to break through the German cordon and eventually reach neutral Spain. They fought with bayonets, with knives, with their fists, with whatever they had. Newman himself was captured at dawn, along with most of the survivors. They were taken first to La Baule, then to the prisoner of war camp at Rennes, and eventually to officer camps in Germany, including Oflag 9A at Spangenberg. Newman's Victoria Cross was not gazetted until June of 1945, because until the end of the war, the British authorities could not confirm whether he was alive or dead. He survived. He returned to England after liberation and went back to civil engineering. He never sought public attention for what he had done. He died in 1972 at the age of 67. 5 men made it through. According to the regimental history of No. 2 Commando, they were Corporal Wheeler, Lance Corporal Sims, Lance Corporal Douglas, Lance Sergeant Howarth, and Private Harding. They evaded capture, crossed occupied France with the help of French civilians, crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, eventually reached Gibraltar, 5 men out of more than 260. Every like on this video stands for a man who crossed that bridge at St Nazaire in the dark, out of ammunition, heading into a fight he could not win, because the man beside him was going, and he was not going to be the one who stayed behind. That is not a small thing, and it deserves to be remembered by people who were not there. Dawn came over St Nazaire on March 28th. The fighting was over. The docks were littered with the dead. The river was choked with the burning wreckage of the motor launches. Campbeltown sat embedded in the caisson, silent, still. German troops and engineers had been aboard her for hours. They had walked every compartment. They had examined the damage. They had noted the strange construction of the bow, the extra armor plating, the unusual configuration of the remaining funnels. They had found nothing that alarmed them. The ship's papers had been destroyed by the crew before capture. No documents survived that might have explained the concrete-sealed tanks behind the forward gun support. The Naval War Staff in Paris was notified that an old British destroyer had been rammed into the dock gate, but that damage appeared to be superficial. German war correspondents were brought to the scene and photographed the wreck. The official assessment was that the British had made a brave but ultimately futile gesture. One German interrogator, speaking to the captured Captain Beatty, told him bluntly that it would not take long to fix the damage. The implication was clear. The British had sacrificed hundreds of men for nothing. As the morning wore on, the wreck became a tourist attraction. German soldiers climbed aboard looking for souvenirs. Officers posed for photographs. A formal party of approximately 40 senior officers and civilian administrators assembled for an official inspection tour. By 10 o'clock, the area around the dock was crowded with Germans who had come to see the strange British ship that had tried to break their gate. At 10:35 in the morning, the pencil fuses that Nigel Tibbets had armed, the fuses that should have fired hours earlier but had been delayed by a chemical irregularity in the acid timing mechanism, finally completed their work. 4.5 tons of amatol detonated inside the bow of HMS Campbeltown. The explosion was heard across the city. The bow of the ship vaporized. The 1,500-ton caisson was ripped from its foundations. The Atlantic poured through the gap and flooded the dock. Every person on or near the ship was killed. Over 350 German soldiers, officers, engineers, and administrators died in the blast. It was the single deadliest moment of the entire operation. The dock that the Germans had been told would be quickly repaired was gone. Captain Beatty was under interrogation when the explosion occurred. He heard it. His German interrogator heard it. There was a silence, and then Beatty, who had said nothing for hours, who had endured the German officer's condescension without protest, looked at him and said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "We are not quite as foolish as you think." The German interrogator said nothing. There was nothing to say. Every assumption the German Navy had made about the raid in the previous 8 hours had just been proved wrong. They had assumed the ramming was the attack. It was the delivery mechanism. They had assumed the destroyer was the weapon. It was the container for the weapon. They had assumed the Commandos were the main effort. They were the supporting effort. The main effort had been sitting in the bow of the ship the whole time, in plain sight, behind concrete, waiting. Beatty was 33 years old. He had been born in Leighton, Montgomeryshire, in Wales, the son of a clergyman. He had joined the Royal Navy in 1925. He had commanded the destroyer Vivian before taking command of Campbeltown, specifically for this operation, in March of 1942. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. His Victoria Cross was awarded for the 6 minutes between raising the white ensign and hitting the dock gate, 6 minutes in which he stood in the open on a bridge, with no protection, correcting his helmsman's course, while every gun in the harbour fired at his ship. He never spoke about those 6 minutes publicly. He died in 1975. But the story of what the Germans found at St Nazaire was not over. 2 days later, on March 30th, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, 2 more explosions rocked the dock area. These were the delayed action torpedoes fired by motor torpedo boat 7-4 during the raid. Sub-Lieutenant McWin had fired them into the lock gates of the old entrance in the early hours of March 28th, and their long delay fuses had been set to detonate days later. They went off more than 60 hours after being fired, exactly as the planners had intended. The effect on the German garrison was catastrophic, not because of the physical damage, which was significant but secondary, but because of the psychological impact. The Germans had spent 2 days believing the crisis was over. They had buried their dead, they had begun repairs, they had restored order, and now, with no warning, the dock was exploding again. Panic swept through the garrison. German sentries opened fire in every direction. Organisation tot workers, French labourers in khaki uniforms, fled the dock area and were mistaken for British commandos. German soldiers shot at them. German soldiers shot at each other. In the confusion, 16 French civilians were killed, and roughly 30 more were wounded. For hours the port of St Nazaire was a place where the German garrison was at war with its own shadow. The delayed explosions, first the Campbeltown and then the torpedoes, had done something that no conventional military attack could have done. They had planted in the mind of every German officer on the Atlantic coast the idea that the British could leave destruction behind them, that a raid might appear to be over and not be over, that the wreckage itself might be the weapon. It was a form of psychological warfare that no German training manual had prepared them for. The British had weaponized time. They had turned the interval between the raid and the explosion into a trap, and the Germans had walked into it because it never occurred to them that a ship that looked dead could still be lethal. The question that matters is the one we started with. Not how, but why. Why did 600 men volunteer for a mission that they were told, honestly and plainly, most of them would not come back from? The answer is not glory. The answer is not recklessness. The answer is something harder to explain and more uncomfortable to sit with. Britain, in March of 1942, was a country that had been losing the war for 2 years and knew it. Singapore had fallen to Japan in February. 70,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers had surrendered, the worst capitulation in British military history. The Battle of the Atlantic was at crisis point. Churchill later admitted that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war. North Africa was going badly. The convoys to Russia were being mauled. There had been no major British offensive victory since the war began. The country needed proof that it could still strike back. Combined operations under Lord Louis Mountbatten had been created for exactly this purpose. Mountbatten, young, ambitious, and willing to accept casualties that made more cautious men flinch, had built an organisation whose entire reason for existing was the raid. Hit the enemy where he feels safe. Do damage out of proportion to the force employed. Accept the cost. Withdraw. The Vagsø raid in Norway in December 1941 and the Bruneval radar raid in February 1942 had proved the concept. But St Nazaire was something different. It was not a raid on a garrison or a radar station. It was a strategic strike at the heart of German naval capability in the Atlantic. The men who volunteered for it understood that. They were not tricked. They were not deceived about the odds. The planning documents, which have survived, refer to it frankly as an operation from which most of the force would not return. What drove them was not a doctrine. It was not a manual. It was not even patriotism in the flag-waving sense. It was something quieter and more stubborn than that. It was the understanding, felt rather than spoken, that this was one of those rare moments when an individual's willingness to accept personal destruction could change the strategic balance of the war. Tirpitz could not be bombed. She could not be torpedoed in her fjord. She could not be ignored. But her dock, the one dock that made her an Atlantic threat, could be destroyed by men who were willing to sail a ship full of explosives into it and die in the process. The commando idea itself was barely 2 years old. Churchill had called for their creation in June of 1940, in the black weeks after Dunkirk, when Britain had been expelled from the continent and the only offensive option available was the raid. He wanted specially trained troops of the Hunter class who could develop a reign of terror along the enemy-occupied coasts. The men who answered the call were volunteers drawn from every regiment and corps in the British Army, selected for physical fitness, initiative, and what the training staff described simply as determination. They were not supermen. They were ordinary soldiers who had put their hands up when someone asked who wanted to do something difficult. The training was brutal. It was conducted in the Scottish Highlands, in the mountains, around Achnacarry, in conditions designed to simulate the worst that combat could offer, with live ammunition, forced marches, cliff assaults, and boat landings in freezing water. Men who could not keep up were returned to their units without stigma. The ones who remained were not selected for obedience, they were selected for judgment. A commando, as the training doctrine had it, was a man who could be trusted to make the right decision when nobody was there to give him an order. That was the entire point. The men of Operation Chariot were not professional killers. Charles Newman was a civil engineer from Essex. Stuart Chant was a young officer who would write his memoirs after the war in the quiet prose of a man who still could not quite believe what he had done. Bill Pritchard was a railway dockyard man, whose knowledge of pumping machinery came from the Great Western Railway, not from the War Office. Thomas Durant was a butcher's boy who had joined the Royal Engineers at 18 because he needed a steady job. Robert Ryder was a polar explorer who had spent years in Antarctica cataloguing ice formations. These were not men who had been raised for war. They were men who had been shaped by a civilian world and who carried the habits of that world into battle, the habits of solving problems with whatever was at hand, of trusting the man next to them, and of finishing the job because someone had to and the someone had turned out to be them. The German reaction to St Nazaire reached all the way to the top. Hitler was furious that a British force had sailed 6 miles up the Loire estuary into a fortified port without being stopped. He dismissed senior officers. He ordered an immediate review of port defences along the entire Atlantic coast. The raid refocused German energy on what would become the Atlantic Wall, the vast fortification project that by August of 1942 had Hitler ordering the construction of 15,000 concrete bunkers from Norway to Spain. Men, material and attention that might have gone to the Eastern Front or to the U-boat campaign were diverted instead to defending against the possibility that the British might try something like St Nazaire again. And in October of 1942, after the Dieppe raid in August and the Sark raid in early October added further provocation, Hitler issued the Kommando Befehl, the Commando Order. It directed that all captured commandos, even those in uniform, even those attempting to surrender, were to be executed without trial. The order was distributed in only 12 copies. It was classified as top secret. It would become a war crimes charge at the Nuremberg trials. St Nazaire had begun the escalation. Dieppe and Sark finished it. The fact that the order was issued at all tells you how deeply the British raiding campaign, which St Nazaire had pioneered at scale, had rattled the German High Command. You do not order the execution of prisoners because you are unimpressed by their tactics. You do it because you are afraid of them. The Formé Écluse Louis Joubert, the Normandie Dock at St Nazaire, was not repaired during the war. The explosion had not merely damaged the caisson, it had destroyed the entire gate mechanism, wrecked the dock walls, and flooded the enormous basin with millions of gallons of seawater that could not be pumped out because Stuart Chant and his demolition team had already destroyed the pumping station. The dock was a ruin. It did not function again until 1947. It was not formally recommissioned until 1950. The first ship to use the rebuilt dock was the former German liner Europa, refitted and renamed SS Liberté, given to France as compensation for the loss of the original Normandie, which had burned in New York in February of 1942, barely a month before the raid. There is a symmetry in that fact that the planners of Operation Chariot would have appreciated. The Tirpitz never entered the Atlantic. She spent the rest of her life in Norwegian fjords, hunted by midget submarines and bombers, a 42,000-ton warship reduced to hiding in the cold water beneath camouflage nets, constantly moving from anchorage to anchorage, never firing her main guns at an enemy warship. On September 22, 1943, British midget submarines of the X-Craft flotilla penetrated her defences in Fjord and placed explosive charges under her hull that damaged her badly enough to keep her in dock for 6 months. On November 12, 1944, No. 617 Squadron and No. 9 Squadron of the RAF dropped 12,000-pound tallboy bombs on her in Tromsø fjord. She capsized in the shallow water with a loss of 971 of her crew. She had spent the entire war as a threat that never materialized, a weapon that was never used, because the one dock that might have made her an Atlantic predator had been destroyed 2.5 years earlier by a civil engineer, a polar explorer, a butcher's boy, and a force of volunteers who knew they were probably not coming home. The cost of Operation Chariot was measured precisely. Of the approximately 611 men who sailed from Falmouth, 169 were killed. 105 of those were Royal Navy, 64 were Commandos. 215 were taken prisoner. 228 returned to England. 5 made it to Spain. The honours awarded for the raid were unprecedented. 5 Victoria Crosses, the most awarded for any single action of the war. 4 Distinguished Service Orders. 17 Distinguished Service Crosses. 11 Military Crosses. 4 Conspicuous Gallantry Medals. 5 Distinguished Conduct Medals. 24 Distinguished Service Medals, 15 Military Medals, 4 French Croix de Guerre, 51 mentions in dispatches, 89 decorations in total. Churchill wrote in The Hinge of Fate that March closed for us with the brilliant and heroic exploit of St Nazaire. It is one of the very few passages in Churchill's war memoirs where the word heroic appears without qualification or irony. The verdict on Operation Chariot, the honest one, is that it was not a victory in the way that battles are usually won. No territory was taken, no army was defeated, no flag was raised over a captured position. It was a victory in the way that a key being broken off inside a lock is a victory. It did not open any doors, it closed one. And the door it closed, the door that led from a Norwegian fjord through the Atlantic to a dry dock on the French coast, stayed closed for the rest of the war. The book that first told the full story to the British public, written by C. Lucas Phillips and published in 1958, was called The Greatest Raid of All. The title was not the publisher's invention. It was the assessment of the military professionals who studied the operation afterward. No comparable raid, before or since, achieved as much strategic effect at such cost and with such precision. Mountbatten himself, in the words carved on the memorial at Falmouth, said the raid was one of those enterprises which could be attempted only because it seemed, in the eyes of the enemy, to be absolutely impossible. The men who closed it did not know, as they sailed from Falmouth on the afternoon of March 26, whether the plan would work. They did not know whether Campbeltown would reach the dock gate. They did not know whether the fuses would fire. They did not know whether the demolition teams would complete their objectives. They did not know whether any of the motor launches would survive the withdrawal. They knew that the odds were bad. They went anyway, not because they wanted to die, but because the mission required men who were willing to accept that they might, and because when they looked at the man next to them on the deck of a wooden boat in the dark heading up a river towards searchlights and guns, they saw someone who had made the same decision they had, and that was enough. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this story reach the people who want the real history, not the version that skips the cost, not the version that skips the names, but the version that tells you that a butcher's boy from Kent fired a Lewis gun at a German destroyer until he had been hit 16 times and still would not stop. That a civil engineer from Essex led 100 men across a bridge with no ammunition because he had told them he would, and that a polar explorer from India stood on the deck of a burning headquarters ship for over an hour, directing an operation he knew was falling apart because the men in the water were counting on him to stay. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many stories like this one. Most of them are about ordinary people in ordinary uniforms who at one specific moment decided that the situation required something extraordinary, and that the someone who was going to provide it was going to have to be them. And they deserve to be remembered, not as statistics in a casualty report, but by what they actually did, in the dark, on the water, with the guns firing and the boats burning, and the clock inside the bow of an old destroyer ticking toward the moment that would change the war.